human beings are unique in that we're the only animal that is capable of producing symbols in an extensive manner. So in other words, symbols are our thing. To understand symbols better, we have a variety of theoretical approaches. And anthropology, in fact, has a unique perspective on symbols. If we're studying symbols, for example, within aesthetics in philosophy, or within studies of literature, or even sociology, the approach to symbols is different. In anthropology, we bring a variety of approaches, as I mentioned, and I'm going to look through some of these approaches, taking the example of the symbols associated with Christmas. Alright, to start with, let's consider one of the earliest theorists in anthropology, the grandfather of anthropology, Frazer. Now, Frazer's book is entitled The Golden Bough, and his main point is that symbols survive from an international kind of prehistoric culture. So symbols have survived from our ancestors, if you like, through to the contemporary period. And what you can see in modern periods is reflections of these ancient prehistoric symbols. So let's consider the idea of Christmas, which is the birth of Christ. And this fits into a larger picture within Christianity of birth, death, and rebirth. In other words, in Christmas we celebrate the first birth of Christ. At Easter we celebrate Christ being reborn. And this is a very common theme in cultures all around the world. So from Frazer's perspective, this similarity goes back to a prehistoric past. In particular, a story which goes something like this. There was a forest by a lake, and in that lake, in that forest, was a king and priest. He's a kingly priest, one man. In order to become the kingly priest of the forest, he took a branch off a tree and killed the old king. Then he became the king. And what does this morose figure wandering around the lake fear? More than anything, he fears the next person who will come in, take a branch off a tree and use the magic of that branch to kill him. Now for Frazer, this story is a typical story that gets repeated again and again because it dates back to a prehistoric past. And in it we see a simple idea of the king is dead, long live the king. In other words, the king is dead, but the kingship remains and goes into somebody else. And he thought this was quite interesting, and he thought it was actually related to the golden bough of the story. The story is that the person who kills the king and becomes a king himself picks a golden bough off a tree. And he thought that golden bough most possibly was a kind of parasite, if you like, which we know as mistletoe. Mistletoe, as you might know, around the period of December, as all the leaves fall off the tree, mistletoe grows on the tree. So while everything else is dying, the mistletoe comes to life. And for Frazer, this was a symbol of death and rebirth. The tree is ostensibly dying, and then the mistletoe comes to life. Think about Christmas in the Northern Hemisphere. This is the time when the sun is ostensibly dying and needs to be brought back to life, according to our prehistoric ancestors, needs to be brought back to life. Now, what is this mistletoe? The mistletoe you could think of as the soul of the tree. While the body of the tree dies, the soul of the tree remains alive and then gets reborn in spring when on the oak tree, where mistletoe sometimes grows, leaves appear again. So this is an ancient story, and in the same way, ancient man and woman, ancient humans, saw the tree dying and coming back to birth. They see the sun dying and needing to be reborn, and it's reborn through a kind of magic which you could think of like voodoo doll magic, but this is for good, not evil. Voodoo doll magic, wherein by lighting a fire, creating something like a sun, we reheat the sun so it comes back to life. And if we fail in this ritual, everything will die. The sun will continue to die. Imagine your ancient man or woman watching the sun get lower and lower each day as we get towards what is now considered the end of December. You think, well, this will be the end of everything. We'll be in darkness and all die unless something brings it back to mind, so you light a fire. Now, according to this, we can see the story of Christ. We can still accept it. If you're a Christian, you can still accept the story of Christ as true. But we can also see it as resonating. True or false, you can see it as resonating with this story. The story of a king who dies and is reborn. Is born, dies and reborn. In the same way as the king in the woods is born as the king, has died when he's killed, and then reborn in the person who killed him, and so on. So for Frazer, the symbolism of Christmas is particularly evocative, and it's no coincidence then that we have the mistletoe. And when I was a boy, there was a song, I saw Mummy kissing Santa Claus underneath the mistletoe last night. That was how it went. Anyway, underneath the mistletoe, magical things happen like kissing Santa, and also the mistletoe is where the soul resides. So for one other point, actually, I should mention, the Christmas tree, of course, is an evergreen tree. It also symbolises this everlasting life of the soul, which Christ also symbolises. And we have little lights on it, so while ostensibly everything's dying, we use the fires, the Christmas lights, to bring the sun back, to make the sun reborn, the Son of God and the sun in the sky, if you like. So that's the general, if you like, a Frazerian approach. To be honest, that approach is no longer used in anthropology, but we still wonder at it. It's such a magnificent and wonderful scope in that story. The next theorist I want to draw on is, more properly speaking, a sociologist rather than an anthropologist. But as a sociologist, Durkheim has had a profound influence on anthropology. And his approach to symbols isn't to look into the past, for some prehistoric origins, but rather looking at what it does in society. And his approach is called functional, and functional means that phenomena, that is things in culture and society, tend on the whole to help preserve society and preserve the individual. What would happen if most phenomena, most things in society and culture tended to lead to the destruction of society? Well, society would be destroyed. It makes sense. We need things that keep us going as a society. And one of these things, the most powerful thing according to Durkheim that keeps us going as a society, cooperating in solidarity, is symbols. In other words, symbols are crucial for the functioning, for the survival of humankind. Now, so if we take, for example, at Christmas, one of the things we think about is the cross. The cross. Probably more at Easter we think about the cross, but anyway, work with me on this one, the cross. What is it that we worship when we worship the cross? I mean, literally we think of it as the thing which Christ dies on, as a symbol of his suffering, and that's fine. But what is it in the cross that we're actually worshipping? If I make a cross from wood and put it up in a church, people will worship that. But why would they worship it? Durkheim says, yeah, sure, we can explain it as this is a symbol of Christ's suffering and stuff like this. But at the same time, in that cross, we see Christianity. There's a Christianness, if you like. Christianity imbues that cross. And that's what we're worshipping, this kind of Christianness, this Christianity. And where else does this Christianity reside? Well, we think of it in Christ and God. But we also think of it in terms of the whole community of Christians, Christendom, if you like. In other words, we're worshipping not just Christ and God, and not just his suffering, but we're also worshipping ourselves as Christians, as Christendom. And the reason why this is important, is that it creates solidarity. It makes us into a group. And that, if you like, would be a Durkheim's understanding of the symbols of Christianity, the symbols of Christmas. Now, let's move on to Freud. Sigmund Freud is a name I don't need to introduce you to. He isn't an anthropologist per se, however his ideas have been very influential in anthropology, so I will talk about him for a minute. Now, for Freud, in various writings, he decided that our belief in God stems from what you could call the Oedipal conflict, the Oedipal or Oedipal, depending on your pronunciation, the Oedipal conflict. This is a story of Oedipus Rex, who unknowingly slaughtered his own father and slept with his own mother. And for Freud, we all have a desire, for example, to possess our mother as an infant. To possess our mother, to solely possess her. You know, that's why children scream when you take them off the breast, and why they calm when they're on the breast. And children see their father as a force which gets in between them and the breast, or the breast, mother, me, I. It's all indistinguishable for an infant, apparently. Well, according to the theory, anyway. So the idea is that you resent your father so much. It's like in a childlike way, you want to kill him, right? It's according to Freud anyway, this is a childlike desire. And sometimes you'll hear kids talking about wanting to kill their friend or something when they're really worked up. So it's quite typical for children to think in this way. It's not it doesn't have the sort of finality, if you like, that the idea of killing and death has for adults. So from this guilt, we all, according to the theory, and it's too detailed to go into now, we'll follow this up later in other lectures, according to the theory, we feel some guilt and for wanting to kill our father. And this is kind of too much to deal with, so we kind of project our feelings of guilt and project our father into a godlike figure. There's no coincidence that in English the prayer starts, "Our Father who art in heaven," our Father, because God, according to the theory, is the ultimate Father. And this is part of Freud's idea that these symbols express, and this is the crucial point here, symbols express unconscious desires that our conscious mind can't deal with. So the unconscious trickily, by trick, sends it up to our conscious mind, either by making what's called Freudian slips, saying what you're actually unconsciously thinking, or through symbols which are vague enough to hide the true meaning from us. So Freud saw religion as a kind of unconscious desire, also as a wish fulfillment. We can't deal with the pressures of civilization, of not being able to get everything we want, our unconscious desires to possess everything or kill what we don't like. We can't do this. So we need some sort of consolation for our suffering, and we also fear death and the promise of immortality and so on is what drives the symbols of Christmas and Christianity. It expresses unconscious desires. So that's Freud's theory. Another way of looking at it comes from another psychoanalyst called Jung. Now, for Jung, this idea of rebirth is quite interesting. It doesn't, of course, only occur. It doesn't only occur in the symbols of Christianity and Christmas. It occurs in Egyptian mythology, in fact in mythologies all around the world. Now, Jung wasn't impressed by Frazer's idea that it comes from some prehistoric religion, but rather he saw it as an expression of a collective unconscious that you and I and all humans share. It's not like I telepathically sent it to you, or you telepathically sent it to me, or there's any kind of telepathic or extrasensory connection between you and me. But just as we are created almost instinctually as human, we possess these kinds of archetypes, these images of rebirth and being born twice, once physically and once in our soul, being born again. So this is a mystery, if you like, and it gets expressed, this unconscious idea gets expressed in stories like the story of Christ, and relates to an archetype we have of two mothers, a mother which gives birth to our spirit and a mother which gives birth to our body. And we have this sort of we all share this archetypal image as humans. So that's a Jungian approach, if you like, to the symbols of Christmas. Let's move to perhaps the greatest mid-century anthropologist, a Frenchman by the name of Claude Lévi-Strauss. Now, Lévi-Strauss' ideas are very complicated and possibly too difficult to go into now. But again, Lévi-Strauss observes the similarity of structure between, for example, the symbols and myths of Christianity and other cultures. He doesn't, like Frazer, explain it in terms of our ancestral origins, our prehistoric ancestral origins. He doesn't, like Jung, explain it in terms of a collective unconscious. Rather, he explains it in terms of structures, that there are kind of innate structures to thought. Let's call them innate. Maybe that we acquire them, but in any way, all humans acquire symbolic vocabularies and stories which are structured in a very similar way. So in Tonga, for example, there's a story of a king who goes to visit a couple on a faraway island, and the couple have had a famine. They have had no good harvest and they have nothing to give the king. So they take their only daughter and put her in a pot and cook her. And from that pot grows a plant called kava. A rat comes along and eats the kava and goes into a disoriented or intoxicated state, and they discover the properties of kava and then serve it to the king. Now, kava is still, in Fiji and Tonga, a chiefly privilege. It's commoners can drink it, but there's a special ceremony and privilege associated with kava drinking in these countries today. And we can see the similarities between this myth and the myth or the story of Christianity, of Christ. The parents, Mary and God, gave up their only son in the same way the mother and father on this island gave up their only daughter. And when Lévi-Strauss sees these parallels, son, daughter, maybe king comes in one story, three kings come in another story, he sees parallels, and underneath all this he sees structures. And these structures determine the way we think and understand reality. So that's an approach to the symbols of Christmas that Lévi-Strauss might bring. Now, I want to look at a couple more. I know you must be getting tired, but I love this stuff. It's fascinating to me. So I will now discuss Eric Wolf, a fantastic anthropologist whose work really pioneered Marxist anthropology, if you like. And one of his works is about the Virgin of Guadalupe. The Virgin of Guadalupe was a virgin who appeared to Native American and Indian in Mexico right after the conquest by the conquistadors. Now, this Virgin Mary, the Virgin of Guadalupe, is a very common symbol. You'll see it in San Diego on a cab driver's rear vision mirror. You'll see it all around the Mexican world, if you like, spreading up into the USA right now. And he said, what is the power of this symbol? He said the power is that it's multivocal, many vocal voices. It has many voices. It speaks different things to different people. To the Indians, to the indigenous people of Mexico, because the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared to a new convert on the place of Tonantzin, the old earth goddess, the pre-Christian earth goddess, they saw this Virgin of Guadalupe as basically Tonantzin, a rebirth, if you like, a return of the old gods of the pre-Christian gods. For the people who are disinherited, who lost their land, who lost everything with the conquest, and still today are struggling with the consequences of these events 500 years ago, the Virgin Guadalupe symbolizes as the wish to possess the country and to drive out the Spanish overlords. In other words, the Virgin of Guadalupe promises to return Mexico to its pristine state, a land of milk and honey, a land of fairness. And this is the dream, if you like, or not the dream, the symbol, what it symbolizes, the aspirations of these people. Now, for those sons with Mexican fathers, the Virgin represents a rebellion against the authoritative father. According to Woolf, the Spanish families were quite authoritative. The father had a very authoritative role, and thus the death of Christ for these sons was very evocative of the desire for the father to die, the death of the father, and the connection with the mother. So he looks at three different groups and says this one symbol can mean different things to different groups. And he says this is also important in keeping society together, but also expresses the class distinctions, the distinction between the Mexicans at the top of the hierarchy, if you like, the Indian families and the disinherited families, and how they all work together in society. Another approach is radically different. That's the ecological approach. We might ask why, if we're not even sure when, typically we think we're unsure about when Christ was born, why we celebrate it on December 25th when the sun's at its lowest. Well, we could use an ecological approach. Now I'm just going to guess here, but it could be something like this. The Christmas rite, ritual, and the symbols associated with it go back to pre-Christian pagan days. Most of us accept that now. Why do we need to have a big feast around December, end of December? Well, we could say the stocks of feed for the cattle, grass and so on, have probably by this stage decreased to such an extent that the animals will start losing protein and fat. We can't feed them enough, and they'll just use that to survive. In other words, we've invested all this straw in our and other dried grains in our animals, and if they keep on going living for much longer now, once we've run out of the straw, all the protein and fat and all the essential nutrients that they have created through digesting the straw and creating it into muscle mass will start to diminish. They'll start to lose weight, basically. And we don't want them to be skinny, we want them to be fat. The best time to kill them is just when the straw runs out. And maybe this is when it happened. I don't know. This is just an attempt at what an ecological approach to the symbols of Christmas might look like. So this approach is associated with a guy called Rappaport, which I'll talk about again in later lectures. Finally, I'm going to look at Clifford Geertz. Clifford Geertz's idea is that in rituals, symbols come together, models of how the world is and models of how the world should be. Models of how the world is and models of how the world should be. So how the world should be is like a nativity scene, everybody gathered around in peace and calm, even though probably it was a dirty, smelly stable where Jesus was born, and probably smelled pretty bad too, I imagine. Nevertheless, and very cold. But nevertheless, let's just say a beautiful, might be the reality. The vision of the nativity is a beautiful scene of comfort and warmth and a child nurtured lovingly by his parents. And that is a model for us for how to behave in a family. And we copy that model when we have a Christmas dinner in the Western European tradition. Some countries have a lunch, I know, so let's just say in the English or Australian or American tradition, the English-speaking tradition. So then this becomes a model of the world. We create a model of the relationships between parents and children. So the ritual meal, Christmas dinner, is when models of the nativity scene becomes real for us, and it becomes quite confused. We become models of and models for the perfect family, as the nativity scene provides a model of and a model for the perfect family. But it all comes together in the Christmas meal. Okay, apologies, it's been a long one. What I've tried to do is give you a sense of how different anthropological theories, by no means all, I've only really looked at the tip of the iceberg, but how different anthropological theories can be used to understand symbols. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you're interested in more of these anthropological theories, please read my book, The Entangled State. I look forward to seeing you for more 25 concepts in anthropology.